He's just a monster in a tailored suit. He's forgotten how to feel anything at all. You have no idea what lies beneath the ink. Zuri didn't flinch when the iron gates of the Soul Estate locked behind her. She only trembled when the most feared man in the Korean underworld leaned in and whispered the one truth that shattered her world. She knew something was different the moment the seasoned guards bowed to her. A mere caregiver, as if she were the one holding the power. But it wasn't until a rain-drenched night, trapped in his private quarters, that the truth finally cracked open. Park Min-jae wasn't just a patient. He wasn't just a cold-blooded boss. And when he reached out and pressed a heavy, possessive hand to her shoulder, not for medical care but for connection, she finally understood. She wasn't there to heal his body. She had been brought there to save a soul that had been dead for 10 long years. Welcome back to Afro-Korean Story Space, besties. Today's story is a special shout-out to Zuri. You requested I used your name for this caregiver story, and I have, so make sure to say hi in the comments if you're watching. To my returning besties, listen closely. If you stop in the middle of this story, you will have dreams wondering how the Dragon of Soul finally found his peace. Drop a comment right now if you are already excited about the suspense and the romance this story is about to give you. The black gates of the Park Estate slid open with a heavy, mechanical groan that echoed through the silent hills of northern Seoul. Zuri clutched her medical bag to her chest, her fingers trembling against the leather. She was 18,000 miles from home, standing in the mouth of a lion's den she had only heard about in whispered rumors. Her father had warned her that some debts are paid in sweat, and others in silence, but as she was ushered through the marble foyer by two men whose suits couldn't hide the bulge of holstered weapons, she realized she was paying in both. The air inside was cold, smelling of expensive sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. "He is waiting," one of the guards said, his voice as flat as a blade. He led her to a set of massive oak doors. When they opened, the room was dimly lit, the only light spilling from a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glittering, jagged skyline of the city. In the center of the room, Park Min-jae stood with his back to her. He was shirtless, his muscular frame silhouetted against the neon glow of Seoul. Zuri's breath caught in her throat. She had treated soldiers and laborers back in Kampala, but she had never seen a body that looked like a map of war. Across his broad shoulders and down the curve of his spine, a massive traditional dragon was etched in deep ink, its scales appearing to writhe under the flickering city lights. The warrior motifs on his neck and ribs spoke of a life lived in the shadows of violence, a sharp contrast to the neatly styled black hair parted perfectly in the middle. "You're late," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Zuri's chest. He turned slowly, his sharp jawline catching the light. His eyes were intense, piercing through the gloom like a predator assessing a new arrival in its territory. He looked at her not as a healer, but as an acquisition, an object to be studied and controlled. Zuri forced herself to step forward, her soft, elegant features hardening with professional resolve. "The traffic in Seoul is as relentless as its reputation, Mr. Park." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, but his expression remained emotionally guarded, suggesting a deep-seated inner conflict. He gestured to the medical kit. "Then stop talking and start. My men say you are the best. Prove them right." As Zuri reached out, her dark fingers stark against his pale, ink-covered skin, she felt the heat radiating from him. The moment her hand landed on his shoulder to inspect a jagged, unhealed wound near his collarbone, she felt him stiffen. It was a flutter of discomfort, a crack in his armor. For a man who had spent 10 years satisfying no one and feeling nothing, the touch of a woman who wasn't afraid of his ink was the first sign that the winter was finally over. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing Zuri into a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Min-jae sat on the edge of the leather chaise, his posture rigid, his muscular frame still silhouetted against the glittering Seoul skyline. The dragon on his back seemed to watch her with ink-black eyes as she opened her medical kit, the metallic clink of her instruments sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her dark fingers trembled as she soaked a cotton pad in antiseptic. She was 18 years old and miles from the familiar streets of Kampala, standing inches away from a man whose very name made seasoned soldiers bow in fear. "You're trembling," Min-jae said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't turn to look at her, but his intense eyes were fixed on her reflection in the darkened window. Zuri took a steadying breath, forcing her soft features into a mask of professional calm. "It's cold in here, Mr. Park," she lied, though they both knew the chill came from the aura of authority and inner conflict radiating from him. She stepped closer, moving into the space of a predator who moved like a man half his age. As she reached out, the contrast was startling. Her elegant dark skin against the pale, ink-stained map of his shoulder. The moment her trembling fingers finally made contact to clean the jagged wound near his collarbone, a visible jolt went through his frame. It wasn't a flinch of pain, but a reaction to a touch that held no fear, only a strange, healing warmth. Min-jae's sharp jaw tightened, and his breath hitched in a way that made Zuri's own heart hammer against her ribs. For 10 years, his body had been a fortress, touched only by those who wanted something from him or those he intended to destroy. Now, under the steady, gentle pressure of Zuri's hands, the iron discipline he used to run his empire seemed to flicker. She worked in silence, her movements fluid and tender, carefully dabbing away the blood from the warrior motifs etched into his skin. He turned his head slightly, his piercing eyes locking onto hers, studying her with a mix of amusement and something far more possessive. "Why aren't you afraid?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a slight Korean accent that sent a flutter through her stomach. Zuri didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed the bandage down, her touch lingering a second too long. "Fear doesn't heal wounds, Mr. Park," she whispered, realizing in that moment that while she was hired to mend his flesh, it was the cold, calculated emptiness in his gaze that truly needed her care. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce through the heavy gray clouds hanging over Seoul, leaving the Park estate bathed in a cold, artificial light. Zuri walked through the long, echoing hallway toward Min-jae's study, but the usual silence of the house had been replaced by a low, frantic energy. As she approached the half-open double doors, the sound of raised voices stopped her in her tracks. She caught the names of shipping docks and illegal trading routes, territories that spanned 3 countries. The air in the hallway felt thick with the same sense of danger she had felt back in Kampala when whispered stories of ruthless businessmen crossed the wrong people. Peering through the gap, she saw Min-jae standing behind a massive mahogany desk. He was no longer the vulnerable patient she had treated the night before. He was a man whose reputation in the underground business circles made even the strongest men bow and scrape. His broad shoulders filled out a tailored black suit that looked like armor, and his expression was a mask of cold, calculated power. Across from him, a man was trembling, pleading for mercy regarding a debt that had gone wrong in an illegal trading scheme. "You know men fear my name for a reason," Min-jae said, his deep voice carrying a slight Korean accent that felt like a physical weight in the room. "You gambled with money that didn't belong to you, and now your family's safety depends on your cooperation." Zuri pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the reality of the gilded cage she had entered. She wasn't just tending to a wounded man. She was living in the heart of an empire built on fear and blood. The underground circles weren't just stories. They were the reason her passport was in his possession and why she felt like a prized acquisition in a foreign country. When the office doors finally swung open and the terrified man scrambled past her, Zuri found herself locking eyes with Min-jae. He watched her with those piercing steel-gray eyes, his sharp jaw set in a line of grim discipline. She realized then that the price of her silence was the knowledge that the man she was healing was the same man who could eliminate an entire family with a single word. The flutter in her stomach wasn't just attraction anymore. It was the terrifying realization that she was now a part of his world. The following weeks turned the grand estate into a pressure cooker of unspoken tension. Min-jae sat in his private library, the weight of his empire pressing against his shoulders, but for the first time in 10 years, his focus was fractured. He found himself watching the door, his ears tuned to the soft rhythmic sound of Zuri's footsteps. When she entered, the air in the room seemed to shift, losing its sterile, cold edge. She moved with the grace of someone who didn't realize she was being hunted by the gaze of a predator. As she leaned over him to change the dressing on his shoulder, her long braided hair brushed against his skin, a soft sensation that felt more dangerous than a blade. He could smell her, a mix of cocoa butter and the medicinal scent of the clinic, and it made his grip tighten on the arms of his chair. He was a man of steel and discipline, a high-ranking figure whose muscular frame spoke of power and control, yet he felt a strange flutter in his chest that he couldn't suppress. He was becoming uncomfortable, because he was no longer seeing a skilled worker or a caregiver. He was seeing a woman whose soft, elegant features and tender expression were a direct insult to his cold demeanor. "You're staring, Mr. Park," Zuri said softly, her brown eyes meeting his piercing gaze with a boldness that usually made men tremble. Min-jae's sharp jaw tightened. He should have looked away. He should have reminded her of her place in his underground circles, but his tongue felt heavy. He noticed the way the light from the Seoul skyline caught the crystals in her hair and the curve of her lips. It was a distraction he couldn't afford, yet he found himself leaning into her touch, his steel-gray eyes studying her like a prized acquisition he no longer wanted to merely possess, but to understand. "I am merely checking for signs of betrayal," he lied, his deep voice carrying a slight accent that betrayed his own inner conflict. But as his hand accidentally brushed against hers, the spark of electricity that shot up his arm told a different story. He wasn't just noticing her. She was getting under his skin, peeling back the layers of a man who had forgotten how to feel anything but the cold weight of his crown. For the first time, the dragon of Seoul felt vulnerable, and it was the most terrifying sensation he had ever known. The shadows in the master suite seemed to stretch and crawl as the sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, leaving the room in a bruised purple twilight. Min-jae stood by the window, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his broad shoulders casting a long, intimidating shadow across the floor. When Zuri entered with a fresh tray of bandages, the air felt charged, heavy with a silent warning. She moved toward him, her footsteps light on the polished wood, but he didn't turn. "You should leave, Zuri," he said, his deep voice barely more than a rough whisper that vibrated through the dark. Zuri stopped, the medical tray trembling slightly in her hands. "The wound isn't fully closed, Mr. Park. You still need care." Min-jae turned then, his sharp jaw set and his steel-gray eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. He crossed the room in 3 predatory strides, stopping so close she could smell the sharp scent of his cologne and the iron tang of the world he inhabited. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of calculated coldness that hid a storm of inner conflict. "You think you are safe here because I am in this bed and you are the one with the medicine," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "But you have no idea what I am capable of. My name is whispered in rooms where people go to disappear. My life is not a romance. It is a war that spans 3 countries." Zuri lifted her chin, her soft features hardening with a stubbornness that surprised him. "I have seen war before, Min-jae. I am not a child." "You are a dreamer," he countered, his hand suddenly cupping her chin, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly gentle yet felt like a claim. "Being near me isn't a job. It's a target. My enemies don't see a caregiver. They see a weakness to be exploited. It is terrifying to belong to a man like me because once the dragon claims you, there is nowhere left to run. You are trapped in a gilded cage, and the bars are made of my enemies' desires to see me fall." He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, his piercing eyes locked onto her brown ones. "Leave while you still have a soul to save, little bride. Because if you stay, I will consume everything you are." The silence of the estate was louder than the chaos of the city outside, a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains and the cold marble floors. Zuri moved through the library, her eyes landing on the artifacts Min-jae had collected over the last decade. Rare jade carvings, ancient swords, and stacks of ledgers that detailed a fortune large enough to buy half of Seoul. By all accounts, he was a man who had everything. He was a high-ranking underworld figure with the power to move mountains and the wealth to satisfy any whim. But as she watched him staring out at the skyline, his reflection a ghost against the glass, she saw the truth that none of his subordinates dared to notice. For 10 years, Park Min-jae had been starving in a palace of plenty. She approached him slowly, not as a caregiver with a tray of medicine, but as a woman who had spent weeks studying the inner conflict etched into his sharp jawline. He didn't turn, but his posture shifted, his muscular shoulders losing some of their rigid armor. "You have all of this," Zuri whispered, her voice a soft, elegant contrast to the coldness of the room. "The power, the loyalty, the gold. And yet, you look like a man who hasn't eaten in years." Min-jae finally turned, his intense eyes searching hers for a mockery that wasn't there. He saw only a tender affection that made his emotionally guarded mask slip. "Satisfaction is a luxury for those who don't have an empire to defend, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I have spent a decade filling my coffers and emptying my heart. I thought that was the price of survival." Zuri stepped into his space, her hands resting gently on his chest, feeling the steady, heavy thrum of a heart that had been physically unsatisfied by the hollow victories of his world. She realized then that his decade of numbness wasn't because he lacked anything, but because he lacked someone who wasn't afraid to see the man behind the dragon. The money had bought him safety, and the power had bought him fear, but neither had ever offered him warmth. In the dim light of the library, the Dragon of Soul looked less like a predator and more like a man who had been wandering in a 10-year winter, waiting for a single spark to remind him he was still alive. As his hand rose to cover hers, trapping her heat against his skin, the calculated coldness of his life began to melt. He didn't need another territory or another $1 million. He needed the one thing his world could never provide, the soft, healing grace of the woman standing in front of him. The shadows in the garden of the park estate were never just shadows. They were the teeth of a world Zuri was still learning to navigate. She had stepped out for a moment of air, the scent of blooming jasmine providing a brief respite from the heavy sandalwood of Min-jae's study. But the silence of the night was suddenly broken by the crunch of gravel behind her. Before she could turn, a hand clamped over her mouth, and the cold bite of a blade pressed against her throat. "Tell the dragon his debt is due," a voice hissed in her ear, thick with the accent of a rival syndicate. Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs, her soft features contorted in terror. She was a caregiver, a healer, but in this moment she was nothing more than a bargaining chip. Then the air seemed to turn to ice. From the darkness of the veranda, a figure emerged, not with a shout, but with the terrifying silent grace of a predator. Min-jae didn't run, he flowed. Even in the dim moonlight, his muscular frame moved with a lethal precision that made the armed man holding Zuri look like a clumsy amateur. One moment he was 10 paces away, and the next he was a blur of motion. With a strike so fast it was almost invisible, Min-jae caught the intruder's wrist. The sound of snapping bone echoed through the garden, followed by a muffled cry of agony. Min-jae yanked Zuri behind him, his broad back inked with the writhing dragon, forming an unbreakable wall of protection. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands, moving with a disciplined violence that spoke of decades spent at the top of a blood-soaked food chain. He disarmed the second man before the blade could even clear its sheath, his movements calculated and cold. When the threat lay neutralized on the grass, Min-jae turned to Zuri. The intense eyes that usually guarded his inner conflict were now burning with a primal, possessive rage. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin, checking her for wounds with a frantic energy he usually reserved for his empire. "I told you it was terrifying to be near me," he rasped, his breath coming in jagged bursts. His sharp jaw was set, and for the first time the Dragon of Soul didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had almost lost the only thing that made his decade-long winter bearable. Zuri looked up at him, her long braids disheveled, seeing the monster and the protector in the same gaze. She realized then that his grace wasn't just in how he killed, but in the terrifying way he was prepared to burn the world down just to keep her safe. The storm that had been brewing over Seoul finally broke, lashing the windows of the penthouse suite with a rhythmic, violent force. Inside, the air was thick with a different kind of electricity. Min-jae stood by the sprawling glass wall, his shirtless frame reflecting in the dark pane. The dragon on his back seemed to pulse with every flash of lightning that illuminated the room. He hadn't spoken since the incident in the garden, his presence a heavy, emotionally guarded weight that Zuri could feel in her very bones. Zuri walked toward him, her long braids swaying against the silk of her robe. She no longer moved like a servant or a mere caregiver. She moved like a woman who had seen the monster and chose to stay. When she reached him, she didn't reach for her medical bag. Instead, she rested her hands gently on his shoulders, her dark skin a striking contrast against the intricate warrior motifs of his tattoos. Min-jae stiffened, his sharp jawline tightening as he looked down at her. "I told you to be afraid, Zuri. After tonight you know what I am. Why are you still touching me as if I have a soul left to save?" "Because you didn't move like a monster tonight," Zuri whispered, her voice a soft, elegant melody against the roar of the rain. "You moved like a man who was terrified of losing the only light he has left." The truth cracked open in the silence that followed. Min-jae turned, his intense eyes searching hers, the calculated coldness he had spent 10 years perfecting finally shattering. He grabbed her wrists, not with violence, but with a desperate primal need. For a decade, he had been physically unsatisfied, surrounded by people who feared him or wanted to replace him. No one had ever leaned into his darkness to find the man hiding within. 10 years, he rasped, his deep voice cracking. 10 years of nothing but the cold. And then you walk in with your healing hands and your tender expression, and you make me remember what it feels like to burn. He pulled her flush against him, his muscular chest rising and falling in jagged breaths. The inner conflict that had defined him was gone, replaced by a singular possessive focus. In the dim light of the suite, the power dynamic flipped entirely. He wasn't the boss claiming an acquisition. He was a starving man finally finding his feast. As he lowered his head, his lips hovering just inches from hers, Zuri realized that the night everything changed wasn't about the danger outside. It was about the surrender inside. The dragon of soul had finally met the only force strong enough to tame him. The neon pulse of soul hummed far below, but inside the penthouse, the world had shrunk to the space between two heartbeats. Min-jae stood with Zuri in the center of the room, his hand still resting on her waist, but the grip had changed. It was no longer the iron hold of a captor. It was the steady anchor of a man who had finally found his ground. For 10 years, he had built an empire of stone and silence, believing that satisfaction was a ghost he would never catch. He had chased power to fill a void that only a touch like Zuri's, warm, fearless, and honest, could bridge. He stepped back slightly, his intense eyes searching her soft features, looking for any trace of the fear he had tried so hard to instill in her. Instead, he found only a quiet, regal strength. He reached into the pocket of his discarded suit jacket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box, but he didn't open it like a bribe. He placed it in her palm, his fingers lingering over hers. "In my world, everyone is an acquisition," Min-jae said, his deep voice carrying a raw sincerity that stripped away his emotionally guarded mask. "My soldiers, my rivals, even the women who came before you, they were all pieces on a board. But you are the first thing in a decade that I didn't have to break to own." He leaned in, his sharp jawline brushing against her temple as he whispered into her ear, the sound a low vibration that made her heart soar. "I am not claiming you as my caregiver, Zuri, and I am certainly not claiming you as my prize. From this night forward, you are the shadow to my dragon. My empire is yours to command, and my life is yours to protect. We are no longer master and servant. We are equals." Zuri looked at the box, then back at the man who had been a terrifying predator only hours before. The inner conflict that had plagued him was gone, replaced by a resolve that was more powerful than any weapon he possessed. As he leaned down to seal the promise with a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption, the decade of dissatisfaction finally evaporated. The dragon of soul wasn't alone anymore. He had found his heart in the woman who had dared to heal him, and together, they would build a new empire, one where the warmth of their connection was the greatest power of all. The winter was over. The reign of the dragon and his queen had just begun.